Wrestling is built on rivalries, whether it be the greats of the Attitude Era like Austin versus McMahon, or more modern day examples such as Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns. But not all feuds are created equal. No, for every great one, there are some outright terrible rivalries too. But what are the worst of them all? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the Bella twins splitting. Yeah, this one's gone down in infamy over the years since it happened for being so bad it almost certainly led to a decent amount of people switching channels and never tuning back into Raw again. What made it so terrible? Well, while at least with most bad feuds there's some kind of silver lining, like a good promo, camp quality, or even a surprisingly entertaining match, this one had none of that. No, what the war between Brie and Nikki had was instead some of the worst moments ever seen inside of a wrestling ring, with perhaps the bottom of the barrel being the truly terrible Jerry Springer segment where Nikki told her sister she wished she'd died in the womb. Sure, this was made all the worse by the fact that neither of the twins were what you would call good actors. But then we're pretty sure even Meryl Streep and Kate Winslet would have struggled to get this one over. And as if that weren't bad enough, there were the matches. Yeah, we're not expecting technical wizardry from either of the Arizona women, but considering Brie is married to Bryan Danielson and Nikki is an ex-girlfriend of John Cena, then you'd have thought they'd at least have improved. But this appeared not to be the case. So following Nikki's turn to the dark side after she joined up with the Authority during the summer of 2014, the pair had a blow-off at that October's Hell in a Cell, which is best left forgotten, to put it nicely. Still, at least the payoff had something to it, right? Well, no. Because despite Brie being forced to be Nikki's personal assistant for 30 days at this point, the babyface inexplicably turned heel again for no good reason once this period was over and joined forces with her sister once more, despite spending the last month being humiliated by her. Really, if we could go back and erase this one from history, we probably would. But it wouldn't be the only feud from that time period we'd like to rid our minds of forever, because only 1 year later we were all being treated to the saga that was Rusev and Summer Rae versus Dolph Ziggler and Lana. Okay, what is it with Rusev and storylines where someone wants to steal his wife? But while there are a number of examples of such an angle taking place in the Rusev household, the absolute worst of the bunch has to be the time when, after he and Lana had an on-screen split in the summer of 2015, she'd begin managing Dolph Ziggler instead. Why was this one so bad? Well, because after Dolph and Lana started getting closer, Rusev decided he needed to get his own back, and that the best way to do this was to find a new woman of his own in the form of Summer Rae. And so began one of the worst mixed tag feuds in modern memory then. But what makes this one particularly deserving of a spot in today's video isn't just the terrible segments and the matches it birthed. No, while these were bad, particularly the double countout the two men went to at August 23rd SummerSlam, the real horror came with the way it ended. And that's because after Rusev and Lana got married in real life and the story was reported on by TMZ, WWE decided to axe the whole thing as they felt no one would believe the angle anymore. Yes, this was during the latter days of Vince McMahon's booking, and yet another example of how he was seemingly past his creative prime at this point. Need any further examples of this being the case? Just venture back a few years prior to 2010 and 2011 when he was giving us an all-time bad feud between Jerry Lawler and Michael Cole. Now, Jerry Lawler is a legend for a reason, and Michael Cole isn't anywhere near as bad on commentary as his reputation at the time would suggest. But at the beginning of the 2010s, there was one thing they most certainly weren't, and that was great in-ring wrestlers. Sure, the King still laced up his boots from time to time over in Memphis, but his days of hitting the ring on Raw should have been long past him by then. And as for Cole, well, he was never an in-ring talent. So why WWE decided it was a good idea to have Cole turn heel at this point and begin antagonizing his broadcast partner on a weekly basis was anyone's guess. It wasn't like the segments were entertaining. Hell, one of them bombed so spectacularly it's still being talked about today, and that's the time the heel brought Lawler's son Brian Christopher back to the company for one night only. Still, that might not have been that bad had it kept itself largely to the commentary booth, as this was so awful in general in 2010, many fans started tuning it out anyway. But what makes it an all-time flop is that come the time of WrestleMania 27 in April of 2011, the two took their beef to the ring and went almost 14 minutes. That's right, at the biggest show of the year, a significant portion of time was taken up by Jerry Lawler trying his best to do something with a guy who'd never wrestled a match in his life. And this was just as painful to watch as it sounded, but that wasn't even the kicker. No, the kicker was that once it was all said and done, Michael Cole would be declared the winner, albeit by disqualification. Then, as if this weren't bad enough, the two met 2 more times on pay-per-view after that. Once in a tag match at May 1st's Extreme Rules, which also included Jack Swagger and Jim Ross of all people, and then again at May 22nd's Over the Limit in a Kiss My Foot bout. Thankfully though, this latter showing marked the end of the whole thing, and once it was done, WWE was free to move on and never make such a mistake again. That was until they did, of course, because just 1 year later in 2012, on-screen authority figure John Laurinaitis started his own program with John Cena. And yes, we know Laurinaitis was a wrestler in the past, and a fairly successful one at that. Hell, while his brother was riding high as Animal, one half of the Road Warriors, Johnny Ace was spending the 90s over in All Japan Pro Wrestling, taking on legends like Mitsuharu Misawa for the Triple Crown, all while he was inventing the Ace Crusher, the move more commonly known today as the RKO. Come 2012 though, he had long since retired, and so really had no business being in the ring anymore. But that didn't stop WWE from trying to recreate the Austin McMahon angle for the 1000th time here, as, with him being the on-screen general manager of Raw, it was decided he'd be the perfect person to feud with top babyface star John Cena. Sure, this one was relatively short as the pair had only 1 bout, so that's at least some kind of saving grace, but that match was so bad this is only barely a saving grace at all. And what makes it worse is that when Johnny Ace and Big Match John finally met one-on-one at May 20th's Over the Limit pay-per-view in a bout no one was asking for, the company chose to put this one on last, ahead of the WWE title match between CM Punk and Daniel Bryan. But at least that's as bad as things got, right? Well, not quite, because Laurinaitis won the bout when he pinned Cena right in the middle of the ring. That's right, one of the few people who ever got a win over Big Match John during this era wasn't even a full-time wrestler. And yes, Cena did later get his revenge, but that doesn't excuse the catastrophe that was this booking decision. That said, you could argue it still wasn't as bad of a booking decision as pitting the Big Boss Man against Al Snow in 1999 and having the whole thing center around a dead dog. No, you didn't hear us wrong. Towards the turn of the millennium, the Big Boss Man had gone full-blown cartoon villain by deciding that he wanted to make life a living hell for Al Snow in the worst way possible. And the way he chose to do this was by kidnapping his beloved Chihuahua Pepper, then cooking him and serving him up to his former owner in a stew. Honestly, it was the 90s, you had to be there. And it led to Snow understandably being desperate for revenge by any means necessary. It's just a shame that revenge gave us quite possibly the worst match in WWE history then, the infamous Kennel from Hell bout. What was the Kennel from Hell? Well, it was a steel cage with the Hell in a Cell over top of it. Basically a double cage structure for the two combatants to try and escape from. But that wasn't all, because in between those cages were wild dogs hungry for human flesh. At least that's what they were supposed to be. In practice, however, the dogs decided all they wanted to do was poop around the ringside area, leaving the whole thing to quickly turn into an absolute farce as the men in the ring tried their best to keep selling the whole match as being the climax of a bitter blood feud despite this. But no one could save this one at this point, so once it was over, it would quickly be labeled as an all-time stinker, with even Mick Foley taking every opportunity he could to mock his friend Snow for it in the years which followed. And as far as its place in the lineage of Hell in a Cell bouts, well, WWE has quietly excised it from this, with it never really being included in retrospectives for obvious reasons. Still, at least this was the worst feud Ray Traylor was involved in during 1999 though, right? Well, no. Because before the year was out, he'd have another all-time horror show when he started going after the Big Show and his dead father. That's right, years before Christian Cage became the heel he is today of AEW, the man who loves nothing more than to find fatherless young men and mold them in his image, the Big Boss Man was doing something similar with Paul White. Sure, he didn't exactly want to be the Giant's dad or anything, but he did want to torment him over his father's tragic death, and this led to some of the most bizarre segments of the era. And of course, none of these were more bizarre than the time the Big Boss Man invaded Papa White's funeral and drove off with the casket hooked up to the back of his car, leaving the Big Show to climb aboard it and flail around for a few seconds as he desperately attempted to reclaim his dad's corpse. And what makes this one even worse was that the feud was centered around the WWF title. Yes, it would have been one thing if this were a simple mid-card feud in an era where adult film stars and pimps were the order of the day, but when it led to the Big Show and the Big Boss Man having a semi-main event for the top prize in the company at that December's Armageddon pay-per-view, right as the Attitude Era was reaching its peak, things had clearly gone a little too far. After all, while Steve Austin was out injured by this point, there was still a cavalcade of proper main eventers who could and should have been fighting over that belt instead. Names like The Rock, Triple H, Mick Foley, The Undertaker, and Kane. Hell, by then we even had Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle on the roster too. So we guess the lesson to be learned here is that sometimes it's okay to have a bad feud, so long as it knows its place on the card and doesn't try to get ahead of itself by clogging up a main event spot. And that's something which could have certainly been taken into consideration when it comes to our next terrible program as well, because back in the summer of 1994, when most WWF fans wanted to see what was the next chapter in the Bret Hart and Owen Hart feud, Vince McMahon decided to have their steel cage match for the WWF title not main event SummerSlam, as he wanted to go with The Undertaker versus The Undertaker instead. Where do we start with this one? Basically, back in January of 1994 at the Royal Rumble, The Undertaker lost a casket match against then world champion Yokozuna, and afterwards appeared to ascend up to the heavens. Of course, the real reason this had been done was to give Mark Calaway some time off to deal with some nagging injuries. But due to the nature of his exit, it meant something special was going to be required when it came time to reintroduce fans to him once he was healthy again. So, it's just a shame the company chose to bring him back in one of the strangest ways imaginable then, as by the time the summer came around, Ted DiBiase, the original manager of the Dead Man, began claiming that he was going to revive his former client. Once he did that though, it became clear that something wasn't adding up, as this was no Mark Calaway. No, it was a poorly disguised Brian Lee in The Undertaker's ring gear, a far cry from the original fans had come to know and love. And Paul Bearer evidently realized this too, because once the underwhelming reveal happened, he began decrying The Undertaker, as he would become known to fans, as nothing more than a cheap imitation. No, as far as he was concerned, he was the only one who was still in contact with the real Phenom, and now that this pretender had attempted to steal his crown, the OG was planning to come back and make it clear whose yard WWF was. Yes, it was the kind of cartoon camp you'd expect from new generation WWF, and it might not have been all that bad had the inevitable match between the pair been decent. But alas, this wouldn't be the case, as after a bunch of segments featuring Naked Gun star Leslie Nielsen building up the return of the Dead Man aired in the weeks leading up to SummerSlam, it was time for things to hit the ring. And here, after fans had exhausted themselves watching one of the greatest cage matches of all time, they were left cold by the main event, which saw a real Undertaker and a fake Undertaker plot around the ring for just under 9 minutes in complete silence before Mark Calaway mercifully pinned his pretender and ended the entire feud in record time. And just like that, we never saw or heard from the fake Undertaker in WWF ever again, all up until he returned as a whole new character, in Chains that is, where he would compete as a member of the Disciples of Apocalypse. But then that's the new generation era for you, right? Cheesy feuds birthed out of even cheesier ideas. It's not like such a thing would have happened in the Attitude Era, except it did, because aside from the Big Boss Man examples we've already mentioned, there was arguably an even worse feud which came out of the most successful period in the industry's history, and that's the one which pitted Mark Marrow against Sable. That's right, it was in 1998 that Mark Marrow began getting jealous over his real-life wife Sable's success as a cultural phenomenon. And after spending weeks and months verbally abusing his lover on screen, we were supposed to get the big payoff when Sable finally got her revenge. The only problem was that it was hard to buy that revenge when a clearly untrained wrestler, who was about a third of the size of her jacked husband, beat him up with such ease when the two finally met in the ring. Hell, she even laid him out with a powerbomb, something which was so damaging to Marrow's reputation as a legitimate Golden Gloves boxer that Steve Austin allegedly refused to work with the Buffalo native afterwards. And Stone Cold wasn't the only one who wanted no piece of the former Wild Man following this, which was part of the reason why he'd be out of the company entirely before the year was over, with Sable also leaving by his side. A few years later though, Sable would make her return to WWE for one more run, feuding with the likes of Tori Wilson, all while being presented as the on-screen girlfriend of Vince McMahon. And as far as Marrow goes, well, we've yet to see him return to this day, but who knows, maybe one year he'll make a surprise entrance at the Royal Rumble. But as far as feuds which were so bad they destroyed someone's in-ring credibility, this has to rank right up there alongside the worst of them. However, as bad as some things like this could be on WWF TV during the Attitude Era, none of them had anything on what was going on in WCW during 2000, as there was some all-time terrible programs, with the worst of these arguably being the New Blood versus the Millionaires Club. Why was this one so bad? Well, because Vince Russo decided the best thing to do with it was to portray the plucky young performers looking to make a name for themselves as the heels, and the old-timers clogging up the main event scene as the babyfaces. Honestly, it made about as much sense as booking Logan Paul as a babyface, and fans reacted to the decision appropriately, as when the whole thing began in the spring of 2000 following a company-wide reboot, they went mild anytime it presented itself in front of them. Seriously, you have to be trying to have a program which included the likes of Ric Flair, Sting, and Booker T flop so hard. But never question the ability of the King of the Swerves to create an angle of unparalleled horror. And with him at the helm of this one then, the downfall of WCW was sped up, as the whole thing carried on into the summer and gave us such lowlights as Diamond Dallas Page kayfabe quitting the company, Sting and Vampiro having a terrible feud which branched off the main one, and the Bash at the Beach fiasco which led directly to Hulk Hogan walking out on WCW for real, then filing a lawsuit against them where he alleged defamation after Vince Russo called him bald. That's right, this whole video could be made up of nothing but feuds from WCW in 2000. But for the sake of brevity, it's best to just focus on the overarching Millionaires Club versus New Blood angle, as it was representative of everything happening in the Atlanta promotion during that year. But let's move away from WCW for now, though not entirely, because while the next feud we're going to look at did take place during Ruthless Aggression era WWE, it was in the Cruiserweight division, the same division that the former company had made feel so important once before. What are we talking about here? Why, Hornswoggle versus Chavo Guerrero, of course. Of course, this one was so bad it could have literally come from 2000s era WCW and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. What made it so terrible? Well, it revolved around some of the most ridiculous matches in WWE history. And given the fact that this is the company which gave us the aforementioned Kennel from Hell bout, that's quite an achievement. Yes, it didn't matter if it was a cow-tipping match where Chavo had to come down to the ring in a cow suit, a follow-up meeting where the El Paso native was forced to wrestle the whole thing on his knees, or the time Hornswoggle also memorably tricked his rival into following him to the backstage area, only to then paint can Guerrero in the face like he was one of the wet bandits from Home Alone. But even that wasn't the end of it, because in true late 2000s WWE comedy fashion, one of the few highlights that came from the angle, when Chavo Guerrero was then confronted by Macaulay Culkin himself, who just shook his head in confusion over the whole situation, with him likely wondering what exactly was going on at this point. However, things would soon take a turn again for the worse, with the infamous tuxedo match between the two, where Chavo Guerrero ended up getting stripped down to his underwear. Yes, this one was never destined to win any Match of the Year awards, but no matter how bad it got at times, at least the feud did give us a few laughs, much like many of the other rivalries we've discussed today.